Welcome back, everybody. And if this is your first time viewing, welcome. We are here to discuss Chapter 2 of Professor Larry Catá book, Hong Kong Between One Country and Two Systems. Chapter 2 is titled The Clash of Empires, Playing with Fire in the Shadow of the Umbrella Movement. How are you doing today, Professor Backer?
Well, I'm doing just fine. I appreciate the opportunity to revisit these chapters and to talk them through, and I and to do it in a very condensed form, if only to give our listeners a little bit of a taste of what the chapter is about, and hopefully enthuse them or encourage them to actually read the chapter, which hopefully will be far richer than our very short discussion, but very well, and looking forward to our discussion today.
And I'm sure with the events that are captured within this chapter, it is a rich discussion that we will probably be having, and also a read that is filled with an eventful period in time. I guess I should start with the excitement that is captured within this chapter. And I guess is also captured in the picture behind me. Can you tell me a little bit about this picture and how it relates to the chapter?
Oh, sure. The picture actually is a picture that I took on June 9th of the protests that were going on that afternoon, and I was standing over a bridge on a pedestrian walkway over the street, so that we had this extraordinary view of the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who were marching. But the picture was actually taken to do a dual focus. One is on the mass of people who were protesting, those people in Hong Kong who felt strongly enough about the issue that ignited this, which was largely the fugitive extradition law, but with a long fuse going back, depending on who you talk to, 10, 15, or 20 years. Right. But also the people who are standing next to me, who are either photographing it or watching it or looking at it or assessing it. And for me, it was a great metaphor for what was going on then. And I didn't realize it at the time, but probably a metaphor for the arc of events that marked Hong Kong from June of 2019 to June of 2020, and the enactment or the imposition of the national anthem law, and then the national security law, which has now become very famous all over the world. And so for me, the picture, and actually with you in the picture, it makes it even better, because we have a bunch of people, a few people looking down at a very large number of people. The metaphor there, and the people who are looking at it, of course, are up and removed. And they may well represent those who will then react to what is going on in the street. But the street is dominated and controlled. The physical space is controlled by the masses. And then we have people who are, that's you and me, who are not looking at them, but they're looking away. And so we'll see what we can do with this metaphor. I may have now just killed it, or I may have been able to use it for something more useful as we talk about the chapters, but you guys can be the judge of that. And then the chapter, of course, is the very first one in time. It's the as I mentioned earlier, the book is written in a sense as a very
A diary.
analytic diary. Right, it's a very analytic diary, and so it was meant to capture the flavor of events as well as what we didn't know at the time it was written. And this one was written on the 15th of June. The first set of protests had already occurred on the 9th and thereafter, and the protests were taking a more, I'm going to use neutral terms, a more energetic term, which also then produced far more energetic responses by the police. That was also going to mark the way events were going to transpire thereafter. We didn't know this at the time, and it was also going to play a central role in the development of the discursive responses to the protests, first by the Chinese central authorities, the local authorities, by the protest movement itself, not a movement. There is a large number of of different groups who are kind of aligning, but there was no singularity here. And of course, then by the international community, and by the international community, I mean key states, the US and the UK on the one hand, and the international organizations on the other. But we didn't know this at the time. And so when we looked at this when I looked at this on the 15th, I had this fresh in mind, as well as the events that occurred thereafter. And the question at that point was, or the thinking, at least from my perspective at that point, was, what's going to happen? Where's this going? And of course, we do a very bad job looking forward. So the only thing I could do was I did two things. I looked backwards, thinking, oh wait, we kind of sort of saw this before, but not like this. The last time with the umbrella movement in 2014, is this going to be a reprise of the umbrella movement? In which case, we can just sit back, enjoy this, and then watch the sides give a little bit on each side and then remain frustrated, but go back to the status quo without much of an interference by the central authorities? Or that's a lot of people in that picture, or is this going to be different?
So,
and if it's going to be different in what way? Sorry.
And that kind of leads me to my next question. Were there signs, or was there any evidence that was ignored that could have led some to believe in that moment in time that this was not the umbrella movement, this was much different? Chess pieces had been moved. Everyone was not in the same position that they had been when the umbrella movement had occurred. Was that missed by anybody?
Well, yeah, the answer is yes and no. It was missed by, it was probably missed by everyone who is willing to speak publicly. I have no idea what security services around the world were thinking, and I'm very glad I don't know. But with respect to everyone else, yeah, we all guessed wrong, is my guess. We all looked at this. You look at it necessarily from two perspectives. One I've already mentioned, from the perspective of history, and then you project out. And clearly this was not the umbrella movement. It was not the movement before. And maybe this is an eruption that was based on it, that was going to go in the other direction. We kind of knew that that was a possibility, but we didn't think that my sense was at the time that if in fact it went that way, that the consequences were both unknowable, uncontrollable, and likely to be painful for someone. And so if you would have asked me to bet at the time, I would have said no, at some point and fairly soon, cooler heads will prevail. There'll be a lot of backdoor talking, and this will move back to a manageable level of frustration on all sides. And then we'll just keep going. And then the central authorities will start thinking much more strenuously about how they're going to get to 2047, which is the end of the joint declaration. The US and other people would think about how they're going to influence this, and the Hong Kong people are going to do what they can do. That's what I thought. And my guess is a lot of people were thinking, along variations. The people who were committed to one side or the other, of course, were getting very emotional already at this point. People who were quite sympathetic to the positions of the one or more of the groups among the protesters were getting very emotional and looking at this as something that can move forward. The local authorities and the people who are much more supportive of a modus vivendi with the central authorities were looking at this with increasing horror. The central authorities themselves were, I don't know if they were caught unawares, but they were still, for the moment, somewhat off guard and were being very careful about how they were going to respond. And no one really knew. And the international community, of course, at first did what the international community did, was to, basically respect civil and political rights. But, we're in this context. Hong Kong is part of China, but there's this international agreement, and people should kind of take a deep breath and see if they can sort it out. But you started to worry. you started worrying, and it was in that context, of course, that you began thinking about the longer term. For the short term, it was, oh, we've kind of seen this before, not this magnitude, and we've kind of understood the frustrations on all sides, the central authority side, local authority side, local people side, international community side, we kind of understood there, but we've seen this before, and we'll see, unless someone manages to lose control of this thing, whatever that meant at the time, and we weren't sure. You know, the perhaps my thinking was that ultimately it was gonna, you're looking at a couple weeks, maybe a couple months, and then everyone would return back to the normal level of frustration. But of course, that wasn't what happened at all.
And so what events followed this, and were you there for the events that followed, or had you already left?
No, I'd already gone and started following from a distance. But going in, the other part of this thing, of course, and which is what a good chunk of this chapter is about, is I had as I was flying in, these are long flights into Hong Kong from the US, I had been reading and catching up again on some reading that I hadn't done in a while. And a couple of things that I was reading was from one of my, an academic in Beijing who I respect very, very much, and with whom I have had a substantial amount of interaction, Jiang Shigong, who had written a book, I think in 2017, if I remember correctly, on the nature of the relationships of China and Hong Kong, and then had been working through the ideas of the nature of interactions between and among states and subordinate territories, developing a sense of post-global empire, which ironically enough was something that I had been working on as well, but not from the perspective of Marxist-Leninism. I was looking at it from the perspective of liberal democratic globalization. And so there was these alignments, I had these things, and I started reading it, and all of a sudden I go, oh Lord, all right. I think that there's an insight here that may make us worry a little bit. For me at the time, it was academic, and that's why the chapter kind of, you start with a little bit of hand wringing going, wow, this is a little strange. I hope that things don't get too much out of control. And then to, oh, but look, this is lurking in the background and it might make a difference. And ironically enough, it was extraordinarily helpful in framing what winds up happening thereafter. For those of you who haven't read those books, I strongly urge you to do it. It's a great set of readings, whether you agree with him or not, or with me, but it's a great set of readings. And the notion of looking at this both through the lens of Chinese sovereignty and Chinese notions of sovereignty, and through the lens of what appears to be the development of post-global imperial systems, may be worth looking at. And if you give me 1 second, I just, there's a caveat here. When people say imperial, it tends to be it's a trigger word, because for most people, the term connotes 19th century European settler or territorially based ethno-chauvinist, racist, ethnocentric, ethno-super-religious kinds of domination, right, by one group of countries over another, involving colonization and the like. What we appeared, and so it was. But imperialism, of course, has had a very long history. It predated its European colonial version of the 18th and 19th century and its settler version in the 15th and 16th century. It existed within the great civilizations across the world, China, South Asia, Europe, and the like, in different modes well before. And we believe, and certainly I do as well, that it appears to be reemerging in a very different form, shorn of its overt construction, of its overt grounding in, racism, territorial control, all of the usual things that make imperialism a bad thing, but really can be, it's a term used to denote the development of new sets of power relationships, societal, economic, political, and cultural, that will tend to center development from hubs of the more influential centers of these things, and then spread out. And that's, in a sense, sort of what we're looking at for Jiang Shigong, for example. Even the nature of globalization itself was a dry run at the development of this post-global, this new form of imperial system, in this case, normative, right? An imperial system grounded in the disciplinary power of a coherent and deeply aligned in disciplinary, for example, human rights and economic normative establishment. And that brings us, of course, at that point, you get echoes of Chapter 1 and why the UN special procedures were kind of both shocked and wanting to reel back in. But both he and I think, although we do it in very different ways, view whether or not globalization itself was a dry run, it certainly is a template for what appears to be now the development of certainly 2 and perhaps 3 key imperial centers, one based, a Marxist-Leninist one based in the hub in China, a liberal democratic one, certainly based in the United States, and perhaps another one based in Europe, and then regional powers as this template gets replicated down the power chain. And so if you look at this chapter through that lens, now all of a sudden these protests look much more, what's the right word? Much more fraught with risk.
Yes. And that kind of leads into one of my last questions. Come from the point of view in which I read the book. You talked about the calculations that the central government had to make, maybe in response to this, or well, definitely in response to this one situation. And it's interesting because countries all over the world have to make calculations in how they're going to respond to different issues. And within those calculations, they may be using different equations to create those responses. Do you believe that the different equations that there are around the world, the different interpretations, this kind of goes back to what we've already talked about with interpretations, leads to great disagreement and dissent from people in different areas in different countries, in the way different countries react to or respond to situations within their own country?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's a really great question, but one that would require another 300 hours to work through. So I'll give you the short version. The simple answer is yes. The slightly longer answer is, well, what you're really talking about here in terms of the disagreement is a very focused one. And I'm going to use an old shop-worn term, but now used, I think, when you read the chapter, you'll understand, used in a slightly different way. And that is embedded within notions of sovereignty and sovereign organization and what that means. And what we discover, of course, I think, is that with the movement towards internationalization, towards international legalization, international governmentalization, and the like, right? We began talking about sovereignty being multiple. While sovereignty is still embedded in the states, there may be these quasi-superior restraining power at the supranational level and the like. And then within states, sovereignty itself may be both exercised as a complete thing and then delegated or moved around and the like. And all of those may have consequences. The way in which you approach all of those terms, the way in which you approach those relationships are going to be very different, and they're very frustrating, and they're going to be antagonistic. So in this case, and we see this, and in this case, of course, you're going to see this develop in later chapters, especially starting in, I think, in November and December, this becomes crystallized. This is just kind of a foreshadowing here. The West already in its response and in its view of sovereignty begins to look at sovereignty as this fractured thing that can be bargained and that can exist in a kind of polycentric space where sovereignty can be fractured like property. It's just a piece of property. You can have different interests in it, and in the aggregate, it's a unitary concept, but it can be managed in a variety of different ways. So for example, in this context, what we're going to discover later on is that the West begins to think about taking the position, and certainly the protesters do, although never really well articulated, that while China enjoys full territorial sovereignty over Hong Kong, that Hong Kong's autonomy with respect to the development of its civil and political institutions may be an element of sovereign discretion with respect to which China may be constrained in changing. And so here you've got a allocation or division of sovereignty where no one will question China's territorial sovereignty, but that governance sovereignty has been delegated to some extent to the people of Hong Kong and then memorialized in whatever document. The Chinese, on the other hand, the central authorities would look at this and go, oh my God, no, it doesn't work this way. And certainly not in a part of a territory which is integral to the central sovereign. However, notions of imperialism may then, and the realities of interstate relations may effectively limit or constrain sovereign authority in intergovernmental relations based on the relative positions and dependence of different countries. And so that one can be sovereign, but one can be sovereign and dependent, or one can be sovereign and one's sovereignty might be based on the expectation of tribute. Now I'm using an ancient term. Tribute is now maybe much more abstract, right? And so it's in the development of these notions, which for Western thinking is both abhorrent and aberrational, but which in reality may be emerging, that we see a lot of the fighting, and we begin to see some of this emerging even in the first weeks of the protest. It really becomes crystallized over the course of the next several months. But here's the sorry, I'm going to use this expression, here's the big bang.
So is this kind of in some ways based in the question of whose empire will Hong Kong belong to?
Well, I think that is an easy question to answer. The answer is China's, of course, but the question isn't whose empire does it belong to, but the question with respect to territories like Hong Kong, or like countries that are not necessarily hub countries in imperial systems, is to what extent may that sovereign authority be, to what extent can higher ranked sovereigns leverage their authority into and constrain or manage or project their views into dependent territories. The West begins to take the perspective that international law and international rules and principles are themselves sovereignty limiting projections of global authority. The Chinese tend to view that as a fig leaf over the interference by old empires into what is now at long last territory that has been returned to it or receded to it, and therefore as nothing more than good old fashioned interference in their internal affairs. And boom, we're off to the races.
So I guess the final question I'll ask you is, as you noted earlier, these events that lay behind me occurred on June 9th. You didn't write this post until June 15th. At what point did you decide that you were going to bind these together, or continue writing about it and stay alert towards it and create a book out of what was
Oh,
going
yeah, no, that didn't come until much later. On the 9th or the 15th, again, you know, as I mentioned, I thought this was going to be a couple months, deserving of a lot of interest, and there might be some insights that could be useful, you know, to draw out for much more abstract thinking about terms, which is not what the protesters are thinking about at all, which is not what the local authorities are worried about. They're worrying about the day-to-day business of living in government. But, you know, given my own interests as in semiotics and in high level theory, I looked at this as, well, you know, yet another explosion, and it might be very useful. It'll probably be over in a couple of months, and it's worth looking at. I had no idea at the time it was going to last as long as it did, or turn out the way it would. And I certainly had no idea at this time that I would have amassed enough essays, that is, thinking about this at key
on.
points during the year, that this would actually turn out to be something that might be interesting, both as a chronicle and as a highly theoretical view of what is going on very pragmatically on the streets and within the governmental apparatus of the central authorities, local authorities, and international organ. I had never thought that this would turn into a book that might have been of some interest. So no, that comes later.
Do you think that the people behind me, as well as the central authorities, made those same miscalculations?
I wish I could get into their heads. I don't have that power, but I imagine that you know, some people may have been more astutely aware and correctly gauged the risk and the scope of likely outcomes than I did. But I can tell you at this point, no, I didn't, and many of the people that I was talking to, although that's a very limited and very self-selected sample, it wouldn't have entered into our heads. It was a source of lively conversations like the ones we've just had now about the nature of sovereignty, the relationship of Hong Kong to the motherland, the effect and meaning of the international instruments that were used to transfer, the scope and relevance of international law and projections, the relative responsibility of, you know, great discussions. But we thought, well, most of it is going to be academic. Everyone is really mad about the fugitive law and the nature of some of the authority movements of the central authorities, and that this was all going to come out. Everyone would have their say, and we go back more or less to you know, the pot would stop boiling, but it would still be warm. And boy, were we wrong.
Yep, about 28 chapters wrong.
28 chapters wrong, and thank you for reading them.
But all right, well, I think that wraps up our discussion on chapter 2, unless there is something else that you would like to add to the discussion. If not, I once again invite everybody who was listening, all our viewers and listeners, to go out and buy the book once it drops. And
13th of July, 13th of July, the book will launch. So let me do the only thing I'm going to say, a shameless plug for the book launch, which will be a webinar, which will occur on the 13th of July. If you're interested, we will post this to my blog, Law at the End of the Day. I'll make announcements, and hopefully, if you're interested, you can participate with us and then buy the book.
Self-promotion is the greatest type. But all right, thank you for speaking with me again, and we will have chapter 3 coming to you all soon.
All right. Thank you.
See you later.